thank you so much, Dr. Kane, for that gracious introduction. It's truly a privilege and a pleasure to be here with all of you and to be among friends, old friends and new friends. And I always like to bring books. I have a huge book bag over there, and I didn't want to haul it up here, but I wanted to bring this book because after a conversation that Dr. Kane and I had at the Catholic Literature Conference, he mentioned that you were studying Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in the curriculum. And I thought, I wonder if I have any old editions of the poem. So I looked down on our library shelves and I found this volume that was purchased at the Mullen Library basement sale at Catholic University when we were my husband and Dr. Kane were both graduate students for $2. It's a first edition of it has a beautiful gold axe on the front of Tolkien's first translation of, well, not a translation, it's the Middle English version with notes, his scholarly edition that was published over 100 years ago. And I just, did a little Google search online. I thought, maybe this is worth something now. About $1,000. So thank you for enriching the Fahey coffers by helping me to unearth our valuable book that was purchased for $2 at Catholic University about 30 some years ago. So no, it truly is a pleasure. And I realized after I committed to giving a talk on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight that even though I read it as a graduate student and loved it and have returned to it a few times over the years, I don't know how many of you have used the Mother of Divine Grace curriculum, but in the high school literature class, if you had to read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, I taught that a few times to various high schoolers, but I've only actually taught it at the college level once. So I approached this evening with a little bit of trepidation. So my knowledge of it, I realized, was a little rusty. I taught it once about 4 years ago. So it's studied in our curriculum in the second semester of the sophomore year, as it is in yours. And usually our students are in Rome. So I had never taught it. During the COVID year, our Rome semester had to be shortened. And so I was very privileged to teach it then. And so returning to it has been an incredible delight. And I feel like I'm only beginning to unearth the treasures, unlocking them, as Dr. Kane mentioned. So my husband sends his greetings. He's very sorry not to be with us this evening. He was planning on being here, and then I changed the date. Mr. Gutschke was very gracious in accommodating that change. But I started to think about it's very ironic why he's not here. He is a member of the Society of the Cincinnati, which is direct descendants of colonial officers from the Revolutionary War. And this society was founded, and they're having their annual meeting, by George Washington after the Revolutionary War. And the founders were very careful that they didn't want anything medieval. Anything that was like, coats of arms and shields and tabards and those kinds of silly hereditary marks of distinction like the Order of the Bath and the Order of the Garter. They wanted Roman symbols. So the Society of the Cincinnati is a hereditary order that instead of a green sash has a big eagle that they wear. So I thought it was singularly ironic that this hereditary order was having their meeting on the evening that has been selected for me to talk about this poem that closes. I can't remember if it's in your edition or not, but at the end of the manuscript, another hand has written Honi soit qui mal y pense, which is the French motto of the Order of the Garter. Translates as shame to him who thinks evil. And it's worth thinking about why they put that on, why this individual tacked that on to the poem. But I have a little bit of an introduction, so it's going to take me a few minutes to kind of lay out what I want to say and why I want to say it. And then I did give you this rather intimidating handout that has the Middle English. So the editions that I know that you've switched to the Simon Armitage translation recently. That is a facing page translation, which is very good. It doesn't preserve the Middle English orthography, which has these really strange symbols that, obviously inspired people like Tolkien in creating his language of Middle Earth. But it has a couple of letters that are unfamiliar. They're not in our alphabet. And thorn is the first one. It's just simply a TH sound. And then there's something that looks like a 3. That's a really crazy letter. Again, these are, holdovers from Anglo-Saxon that is kind of like a Y, kind of like a G. It's very hard for non-native English speakers to, if you've ever done phonograms as a child, it's this OUGH or OGH or IGH phonogram, which doesn't sound anything like what those letters should be. That's because it used to just be the 3. So in a word, well, it's called yog, but I call it a 3 because it looks like a 3 and that's easier to remember. But if you think about OUGH, it has like 6 different sounds. Ow, oh, ooh, off, aw. So imagine encountering a word with OUGH, whereas, knights, KN, with that letter, GHT, it's going to be pronounced a certain way. So we kind of made things complicated by getting rid of that letter. So I just wanted you to see the original because it's fun. I hope you find it as fun as I do to just sort of parse through what is that word in modern English. Not all of them you can tell with Sir Gawain, but with several of the passages I chose, the cognates with modern English are there. I want to begin by going back to Horace in The Art of Poetry. He characterizes the twin purposes of literature as to teach and to delight. He says that literature is a mix of the useful and the sweet, and it delights and admonishes at the same time. Now, I would argue that the delight portion of that is often downgraded in our understanding of literature to mere entertainment or diversion or a kind of escapism sometimes, or simply the pleasure that a harmless pastime affords. Yet the delight of literature, as I hope to show you in our discussion of this poem, is anything but an escape. As Flannery O'Connor says, literature is not an escape from reality, but when properly balanced with a moral purpose, it's a plunge into reality. That's her quotation, plunge into reality. And the delight of great literature, as I hope to demonstrate with the poem before us this evening, which is, in my view, one of the most delightful in all of English literature, is at once an imaginative delight, an aesthetic delight, and an intellectual delight. It is demanding work to read this poem, but it repays the effort. It's immensely satisfying to read great literature. So part of the delight is in having grasped the meaning of the story, recognizing the excellencies, the clues that the author has placed to aid us in both this moral and aesthetic apprehension, and to awaken and nurture in us what Russell Kirk and Edmund Burke before him had termed the moral imagination. Chaucer echoes these twin purposes in his prologue to the Canterbury Tales, when he says that the storytelling prize, if you remember, it's a storytelling contest among the pilgrims, will go to the pilgrim whose tale has the greatest sentence and solace. Now, sentence is like sententia, it's moral purpose. And solace is an older version of what we would say solace, consolation, which is a different kind of form of the word delight. It's worth thinking about in a Christian context, how literature can be both imparting wisdom and providing a kind of consolation. I would say if Sir Gawain and the Green Knight had been one of the tales, and if I were Harry Bailey, the host of the Tabard Inn, this medieval romance would have been the hands-down winner of the best tale. I'm not exactly sure what sort of pilgrim would have been the tale's teller, but I'll leave that to you to perhaps speculate. Yet, for hundreds of years, this work lay buried, unnoticed, unappreciated. First, it was in Sir Robert Cotton's 17th century library, sitting there contentedly on the top shelf, 10th book in from the left, under the bust of the Roman Emperor Nero. So Cotton organized his library, as some of you may know, using the busts of Roman emperors, and not simply Roman emperors, famous Romans. So he also had a bust of Cleopatra, and this is why the manuscript comes down to us as Cotton Nero A10. So it was on A, the top shelf, the 10th book over in Cotton's library. A few busts down was its friend, Cotton Vitellius A15. I was hoping they'd be across from each other, but I found out that the bust across from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is Cleopatra. That seems somehow appropriate for this poem, if you remember the seduction of the third fit. But both of these manuscripts, the Beowulf manuscript and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, unlike the Canterbury Tales, of which we have dozens of manuscripts or fragments of manuscripts, they're in single manuscripts. There's only one, which is a kind of marvel in a tale that revolves around marvels. It's a kind of marvel in itself. Cotton's library in 1731 suffered an extremely huge fire. Most of the manuscripts were burned. Parts of Beowulf are corrupt because there are char marks on it from various centuries. But these two manuscripts survived. And it wasn't until 1839, I believe, that the first published edition of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight came out. And even then, it wasn't really widely read. So think about it. Shakespeare wasn't reading Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Jane Austen wasn't reading Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So we have to sort of ask ourselves, how is this incorporated into the English literary tradition? And many scholars early in the 20th century said of both Beowulf and Sir Gawain, it isn't. It doesn't really map on. But then, and Tolkien takes a great degree of credit for putting it on the map, but he wasn't the first one, and he wasn't the most vocal one. Long before Tolkien was writing, Gaston Paris was calling it the jewel of medieval English literature. Tolkien himself heralded it as, quote, one of the masterpieces of 14th century art in England and of English literature as a whole. So, yet, this poem, I would suggest, rivals something like the plays of Shakespeare in producing so many varied, conflicting, and I would say incorrect interpretations. Tolkien set out to correct what he thought of as the chief misreading of this poem when he gave a great lecture on it that's included in his volume called The Monsters and the Critics. There he argued that the, quote, nub of the poem, the kernel, as it were, is the 30th stanza of the third fit. He said, if you don't get that right, everything falls apart. So that's a pretty heavy task to make sure you understand the 30th stanza of the third fit. And yet Tolkien recognized this is where all the scholars have gone wrong. That is when Sir Gawain makes his confession. After he's agreed to accept the girdle from the lady and before he set out for the Green Chapel to, suffer the blows. I don't have time to go into Tolkien's argument, but he attributes the misapprehension, the misreading of this central scene to a lack of sympathy with medieval Christendom. He says, quote, "It is no doubt possible to dislike this moral and religious outlook, but the poet has it. And if one does not, with or without dislike, recognize this, the purport and point of the poem will be missed. At any rate, the point that the author intended. Now, I would suggest a modern reader is in danger of taking this a step further, that it's not simply dislike or lack of sympathy with the Christian vision, but ignorance of. And so it's a blank slate. You don't have any knowledge of the liturgical year, the saints' feast days that are mentioned, the many references to Christ, to penance, to sin and forgiveness. It's that is a foreign language. So I would say that we're in even graver danger in our current day of misreading the poem. And unfortunately, I think that has some of the translations have suffered from that general ignorance of Christianity, specifically medieval Christendom, of Catholic Christianity. So in the time I have remaining, I'd like to kind of resituate Tolkien's argument and carry it a step further by suggesting that everything in the poem depends upon how one understands the court's closing laughter and adoption of the green sash as an emblem of renown and honor. And that's actually the last quotation of the poem that I have on the handout from Fit 4. It is perhaps no shock that to contemporary secular readers, the laughter and donning of the girdle is simply a confirmation, and we could call it a girdle, a sash, a baldric. All of these are, in the translation, in the original. A confirmation of Gawain's scrupulosity and his uptightness when contrasted with the Arthurian court's more permissive understanding of morality. So that's a way that a modern reader might look at that ending. Yet I'm surprised that too many Catholic readers, the court's transformation of the baldric from a mark of shame to an emblem of renown seems puzzling, frivolous, or wrong. Further evidence of a lassitude and corruption of the Arthurian court, which will result in its inevitable tragic demise. One recent scholar castigates the court because they, quote, choose to forget its shame and to prize it as fashion. Another suggests that Gawain and his court are tragic failures. Quote, what had been the tragedy of a single night becomes the failure of a whole social order. And recently in an article in Dappled Things, L.C. Ricardo writes, quote, the failure of Arthur's kingdom is par for the course. And as any medieval historian would tell, a clear indication of infidelity to God. The scar left on Sir Gawain by the Green Knight is a gentle yet permanent reminder of his unworthiness. I agree with that. Sir Gawain bears the girdle as additional penance. It is a damning indication of the court's hubris that they misconstrue the girdle as a fashionable accessory. So there's perhaps some of you have read the poem and came away with that same interpretation. But I would like to challenge you with that particular reading, not based on what I think, but based on the meaning of the poem and what the poem suggests to us. Does the court misconstrue the meaning of the girdle? Are they attempting to invert Gawain's understanding of it as a mark of shame? Is Gawain wrong in viewing it as a mark of his shame? Can they both possibly be correct in assigning to it two seemingly incompatible meanings? And what kind of reading do we need to undertake in order to answer these questions? So I've selected several passages to try to guide us toward an understanding that would help us answer those questions. I'm under no illusion. I can't remember what time I started, but I don't want to go beyond my time. So I may have to put some things on the cutting floor and save them for the Q&A. But that's the central question that I wish to address this evening. First, if you look at the first quotation, if we start at the beginning of the poem, certain narrative expectations are established in terms of a story. The court is presented to us as a model of perfection. There are so many superlatives used. It's the best court, the best king, the prettiest wife, the most gallant and courteous knights, the best meals. So if we know our fairy tales and we know our story arcs from Aristotle, what is likely to happen to this best of courts? Are we just going to hear about how great they are for 2,500 lines? Our expectations are set up. Something is going to happen, some sort of rupture. We don't know what it is. We don't know if there's going to be betrayal, deceit, temptation, hubris, vainglory, pride. We don't know what's going to happen, but at least we're kind of put on edge by the very fact of their excellence. But I'd like to pay attention to not simply those superlatives, but a certain part of that quotation, which struck my attention. And it struck my attention because I think this poet, and if we want to establish it as a great work of literature, which I hope we all agree we can, is very attentive to words, their meanings, and the choice of words, and the arrangement of words. The form in which the poem takes informs its meaning. They're not inseparable. So it's an alliterative poem, right? That means in any given line, apart from those 4 lines at the bottom that rhyme called the bob and wheel, in any given line, there's going to be a repetition of consonants. And many people think, this is just going to diminish the poetic value. The poet is limited by this in what words he can choose, because he has to have another W word, he has to have another M word or an L word. And so he's just going to choose whatever he knows that is roughly approximate that. But I think what you find is that the skillful poet is using that alliteration in the most intentional, expansive way possible, so that the choice of a single word can color and dictate the entire meaning of a line. And it's worth paying attention to the particular choices of words. Now, this is a poem that is written around the same time as the Canterbury Tales. And as I was discussing with certain people at dinner, Chaucer and the Gawain poet, and just to answer once and for all that question, is it Gawain or Gawain? Yes. So if you put them in the same room together, they probably would not have really understood each other. So the West Midlands dialect of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is very still has such residual Anglo-Saxon words, but it is influenced by French. Tolkien notes in his introduction that there are, and this is before you could, do Google searches and quantify these things, something like as many original words in this poem as there are lines. So words that only appear once in the entire poem. So that's kind of mind-boggling, given the amount of alliteration, that he's not just randomly repeating words because he needs them. So it's worth thinking about his intentionality in choosing particular words and the way in which he says them. And it's very easy to miss because translators have to. I don't envy the task of a translator. I'm not a translator of this poem. I would find it daunting. I find it much easier to criticize other people's translations, which I will do over the course of the next 20 minutes or so. But if you look at the first passage, there's something important that you shouldn't miss. That would be very easy to miss. The translation, this is the Armitage translation that I've employed there. With all the wonder in the world, they gathered there as one, the most chivalrous and courteous knights known to Christendom, the most wonderful women to have walked in this world, the handsomest king to be crowned at court. So if you notice the word wonder, so if you go back to the first line in the Middle English, you can kind of see which word that's supposed to be. It's wheel, spelled W-E-L-E, which is a kind of archaic word in English now, but it's W-E-A-L, wheel. And I'll get back to that in a moment, the significance of that word wheel, which I think wonder is not a good translation of. Marie Boroff, in her translation, translated as peerless pleasures. Tolkien gets the closest, as he almost always gets the prize. He translates it as bliss. So, with all the bliss in the world, they gathered there as one. It's this part known to Christendom. If you look at the line, and kid there means famous, Kaid. The most Kaid kniks under Christus selven. That's pretty easy. So selven is just self. So Christus selven is Christ himself. And under is under. Now, how might we translate that? The most famous knights under Christ himself. So Tolkien translates it as the knights most renowned after the name of Christ. I think another way of translating that would be, simply to say under Christ. And then we have to ask, what does it mean to be a knight under Christ? And what might be another way of saying that? The most renowned knights, they're actually not. The superlative only goes so far because there's someone higher than them. There's someone higher than the court. And to the extent that they live under Christ, they are the greatest, the most wonderful, the most renowned. Take that away and you take, they're either usurping their place or going against it in some way. So their own significance, their own existence as a chivalric brotherhood is dependent on them living under Christ, living in conformity to Christendom. And that is something that it's good to be reminded of, because I think many people read this opening scene because we know after that, when the Green Knight comes in and he looks around, he's like, who's in charge here? You're a bunch of beardless children. And says, who's going to challenge me? He's going to take up the challenge. And it's, crickets until Arthur himself has to say, well, I'll do it. And then Gawain says, it's not really appropriate for you to do it. I'll do it. So we see kind of fissures in their actions that give us pause. But before that, I think there's a tendency to read those superlatives as ironic, right? They think they're the best, but wait till they're tempted. And I don't think that's a good reading. I don't think that's an appropriate reading. They're not gods. They're humans. And so they're the best that exists. I don't think the author is being ironic. I don't think he's lying when he gives those superlatives. I simply think we have to recognize even the best of the knights mess up and fall short. And if we don't recognize that, then they are like gods. So I think it's important to establish that under Christ at the beginning, as we'll see. And I probably won't have time to get to this wonderful quotation from Blessed Ramon Lull, the Book of the Order of Chivalry. It's certainly a work in my mind that anyone writing chivalric literature in the 14th century would have been familiar with. It was translated into French and circulated widely. But I'll just draw your attention to the ending, and you can read the whole quotation later, because I love the way, especially for our purposes and our audience, that he compares clerks or teachers and knights and them having a certain order that they're custodians of. And to the extent that they fall short of being custodians of that order, they do damage to other people in their care and who trust them. So the last sentence, if clerks and knights were without error, there should hardly be any in other people. So there is the bar is pretty high for the Arthurian court because they are an order under Christ. Okay, the second quotation is after the Green Knight comes in. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I really want to focus on some of the other quotations. But originally, when I had made the title, The Best Book of Romance, Form and Meaning in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, there were two lines that really jumped out at me. This is when the Green Knight comes in and everybody's just kind of in shock. And they gaped with amazement. What did it mean? So this is a poem because, partially because of that it's a very patterned work. Its architectonic is very sophisticated. If you notice how many times threes are mentioned, sets of threes, it's very fairy tale-like. And nowhere is its patterning more apparent and more beautiful than in the depiction of the pentangle that Gawain wears, that adopts as his emblem. Now, the pentangle is almost, I would argue, though, an exception to the rule of clarity on what something signifies. So I'm always a little hesitant when people start going down the road of what does the Green Knight represent? Right? Is he the sun god? Is he the green man of nature? Is he a type of Christ? One commentator calls him an immensely vital figure who's closely associated with the life of nature. So Armitage even is very keen on the poem because it has a kind of environmental subtext for us. But when I read back through the opening description, just to get on the knight's greenness, for instance, and saying, what does the color green symbolize? As if there's a sort of one-to-one correspondence in these things in the poem. I was struck when I went back over it with the recognition that he's not just green. He's not. There are at least 6 times when another color is mentioned. In his body, in his hair, in his clothing, in his armor. He's a green and gold knight. He's a gilded knight. I thought I'd start a movement to change the title Sir Gawain and the Green Gilded Knight, but I don't think it would go very far. But it's worth thinking about that very fact that he is, not simply of nature. Gold isn't something that, man and beast in their natural condition have. And when we think about in the 14th century what that color gold might be associated with, it's worth pondering. But it is worth pondering. If we search for these one-to-one representations, it really flattens out the meaning. This is part of why Tolkien really did not like allegorical readings of his own literature. It's like with the hunt scenes, these parallel seduction and hunt scenes, how is Gawain in this scene acting like a deer? How is he acting like a boar? Now he's acting like a fox. I think it's obviously those scenes have been put in parallel presentation for a reason, but if we're looking for one single key to unlock that, I think there's a kind of danger in that. And the poet guides us to that. When he wants to tell you there's a signification, he'll tell you. So when he's talking about the pentangle, he'll say it betokens this, it signifies this, it's the form of this. He's very clear there's a one-to-one correspondence, the 5 5s. When he talks about the Green Knight, he says, for each man had marvel what it might mean. And meaning is a little bit different. And here again, I'm guided by Flannery O'Connor. I was so delighted. I never thought in talking about a 14th century poem, I'd be able to get in not only 1, but 2 quotations from Flannery O'Connor. She talks about it, but I think it's very relevant to this issue. quote, people are always asking, what's the theme of the story? Can you just tell me what this represents? Can you tell me the theme of the story? I prefer to talk about the meaning in a story rather than the theme. People talk about the theme of a story as if it were like the string of a sack of chicken feed. They think if you can pick out the theme the way you pick the right thread in the chicken feed sack, you can rip the story open and feed the chickens. But this is not the way meaning works in fiction. When you can state the theme of a story and separate it from the story itself, you can be sure the story's not a very good one. The meaning of a story is embodied in it. It has to be made concrete in the story. Story is a way of saying something that can't be said in any other way. And it takes every word in the story to say what the meaning is. You tell a story because a statement would be inadequate. There's a place for statements. The meaning of fiction is not abstract meaning, but experienced meaning. And the purpose of making statements about the meaning of a story is only to help you experience that meaning more fully. So everything I'm saying tonight, I'm hoping will help you experience that meaning more fully. So the next quotation has to do with the form. And that's from the beginning of the second fit. It's a beautiful quotation. And I don't have enough time to go through all of it. But it's worth thinking about the relationship between form and meaning. Because you have a pattern that is established. You have the moral order that is established. But we know that even if the pattern is there, the realm of human action is pretty messy. And so it doesn't always follow the pattern. The form rarely yields to the finishment, the final result. I don't want to say too much more about that, but it's worth thinking about. This is a poem that has a lot of seeming contraries in it, or things that are presented in relationship to each other. Joy and sorrow, dead seriousness and playfulness and game, the natural and the supernatural, courtliness and intense visceral violence, individual action and the community, death and regeneration. So it's also asking us to consider how time functions. So to say the form and the finishment foldus, full ofta, and that word foldus, a Z at the end of a word, EZ is just like an S. It's a verb, right? Foldus, full often. A year, the first line is, a year passes swiftly. So yearness is passes, full yearn, swiftly, and yields never like. So a year passes swiftly, and no two are ever the same. Now, this passage occurs just before the poet goes through the seasons. And we know that there's a cycle. The cycle repeats, but each year is not the same, even though the cycle is repeated. So it's worth pondering that in relation to what takes place in the poem, where we begin and where we end. I'd like to turn to that fourth quotation, which might seem like a minor quotation. This is shortly after the Green Knight, after his travails and his prayer, just please let me get to somewhere to say mass, hear mass on Christmas Day. And all of a sudden this palace appears that looks like it's made of paper. It's just, an answer to his prayers. So he goes in and this is the lines about Christmas morning. The translation, so the morning dawns when man remembers the day our Redeemer was born to die, and every house on earth is joyful for Lord Jesus. So we remember at the opening of the poem, it's the Christmas season. So here we are again on the cusp of that same season, but it's quite a bit different. Instead of the celebratory feast, Gawain knows in 3 days' time, I have to go off and receive a blow from the Green Knight. I want to get back to that word wheel because I think it's an important word. I think it's a significant word in helping us understand or approach the meaning of the story. If you look at the original Middle English, on that morn, as each man minds that time, that drichten for our destiny to die, what's born. So drichten is the Anglo-Saxon word for Lord. It's a kind of, military word. In the Dream of the Rood, our Lord is called drichten. Is a very Anglo-Saxon word when he could have chosen Lord. So it's worth pondering that. But this is Christmas. And how does he characterize Christmas and the celebration of Christmas? We're celebrating what? We're celebrating death. Essentially, we're celebrating Christ's death for our destiny. Wheel waxes in each a wonen world for his sake. So if we know anything about alliteration, some of these alliterative pairs still come down to us, right? So it's wheel and what? Woe. If you have contrasted, it's wheel and woe, wax and wane, right? So when we've almost exclusively restricted wax and wane to the actions of the moon, right? So and wheel and woe is a good pairing, right? So these all come down to us from works like Sir Gawain, these kind of alliterative pairings, these contrasts. So wheel there is translated as joyful. Boroff translates it as blithe. Tolkien says, in every home wakes happiness on earth for his sake. I'm not sure if we think about this word wheel and in terms of waxing, why does our wheel swell on Christmas morning? Having to do with our Redeemer being born, with Christ not being born, but coming to die for our sake. So if we think of wheel, the two words that kind of come down to us that are descendants of wheel, that would be wealth, which is a kind of particular form of wheel that we still use today. And the other would be something like commonweal or commonwealth, which is the common good. So wheel is not simply happiness or joy or bliss. When it's waxing, it's an increase in our well-being. Well and wheel are from the same root word in Anglo-Saxon. So we are made more well, or spiritually healthy, I guess you could say, is another way to say it. We're made more well on Christmas Day. And I don't think theologically, spiritually, anyone would dispute that. So it is an increase in our eternal destiny, like exponentially, because of Christ entering the world. So if you ponder just that one word in that placement in relation to Christmas, you see that what Christ has done for us and what the poet recognizes as the the reason to be celebrating Christmas. It's nice to have all these fun games and we get to eat great meals, but really Christmas is about our situations, our fortunes just changed. Our wheel has waxed, and that is something that we replicate every year on Christmas. And in this cycle, within the cycle, that waxing may end up waning because of our sinfulness. But in the linear trajectory of Christ entering the world in time and his sacrifice and death and resurrection, that wheel has already swelled to bursting. So the kind of linear and circular meeting of history is an important part of what this poet is trying to get us to see in relation to the to our condition as Christians. So when we get to the next quotation, which is a little bit longer, and I'll try to kind of condense things here. This is one of my favorite passages. And I think it's one of the most misunderstood passages in the poem. This is the first time the lady comes into Gawain's chamber. And what does Gawain do? It's the first time. By the second and third time, he kind of knows. He knows what's going on. But he does not know. He knows he's supposed to exchange winnings, but, he doesn't know exactly what that means. So the translation, Gawain lay still in a state of false sleep, turning over in his mind what this matter might mean and where the lady's unlikely visit might lead, what this matter might mean. Yet he said to himself, instead of this stealth, I should openly ask her what her actions imply. So he stirred and stretched, turned on his side, lifted his eyelids, and looking alarmed, crossed himself hurriedly with his hand as if saving his life. I don't like that translation. That's called litotes, which is dramatic understatement. I despise that translation. So why do I despise that translation? We all know in our culture what as if means, right? As if, right? It doesn't mean that it means that it has no efficaciousness, no signification. So Boroff translates it as, and signs himself swiftly as safer to be with art. I think she mistranslates hand. So she thinks it's a different word that means art, with art. What does it mean here? And both of them use swiftly or hurriedly, which is not in the original at all. And so it's almost like Gawain's caught off guard. Something bad's going on. He kind of has a sense of it. And, I'm just going to quickly cross myself. And then I'm going to open my eyes and ask her what she means. I kind of need all the help I can get. And, I do this thing now and again when I need a little bit of extra help. So, in the modern understanding, the as if implies a kind of wishful thinking or doubt. That is not what's going on. And if you look at the passage carefully, there's a lot of cognates, so bear with me. See that a full, long while in the first line? Gawain's lying there for a full, long while. She doesn't come in and he opens his eyes. He keeps his eyes shut for a full, long while. We don't know how much it is. The author doesn't say 5 minutes, 10 minutes, but it's not only a while, not only a long while, but it's a full, long while. So we have to assume it's a bit of time. And it gives him time to do what? It gives him time to consult his conscience. And this is one of the few, if I remember correctly, the only times when Gawain says something to himself. I think there might be one other time. So after consulting his conscience, he says, and nobody else translates it as conscience. I think Boroff does. He says, it would be better for me to talk to her and to find out what she's up to. So have my spell in space. And then I love this part about unlocking his eyelids. Like, why would you take that out of the poem? I mean, those of you who have to drag yourselves out of bed for an 8 o'clock class, you're unlocking your eyelids, right? You're getting, there's a struggle there. You're not just lifting them or opening your eyes. There's a suitability there. And again, it's just a loss. I mean, we're not dumb. We like those sorts of things. Why dumb it down for us? Why put it in recognizable speech? And then he signed himself as by his prayer, the safer to worth. So as by, it's not as if, it's as by. Now, you all know your prepositions. What does by mean? Through, I think in this case, it's something like by means of. So as by is simply, for by is another way of saying it in Middle English. For by, therefore by this. And 4 times since I arrived this evening, I've signed myself in communion with other members of the Thomas Aquinas community. And that's not like an empty gesture to a medieval Christian. That's a pretty big deal. And so every, reading of it trivializes it. And it's like, oh, I'm really in trouble. Guess I better do this thing really quickly. He's putting on the spiritual armor. He's invoking Christ. He's invoking our Lord's protection. Who gets it right? Of course, Tolkien, who translates it as signed himself with a cross, thus safer to be kept aright. That's what he's doing. And so when there's all these sort of the Gawain poet is a real dramatist, and he likes to make things really tense. So he often ends the fits or ends sections with, "Oh, things are looking bad for Gawain if Our Lady, doesn't protect him," and it's sort of like, oh yeah. That's right. He invoked protection. So you're kind of thinking, uh-oh, he's in trouble. But there's a little part of you as a Christian who says, he has invoked protection, and I'm just going to hope and pray and trust that everything's going to turn out okay in the end. In which case, we're not dealing with a tragedy. That's not to say that the tragedy doesn't happen later off stage, or that it actually hasn't already happened when the poet is writing the poem. By the time the poet's writing the poem, not only have, Troy and Rome collapsed, but the Arthurian civilization is long in the distant past. But that's not what's happening in the poem. So, okay, I should probably wrap up. But I wanted to at least get to this final quotation of the court, what they're doing. So in passage 6, Gawain has already said to Bertilac, "I'm unworthy. I can't believe I did this. I'm so wretched. I'm going to bear this as a sign of my sin." And he said, "Your problem was you loved life too much. In the big test of chastity, you passed. And so just come clean and we'll move on." So he shows up at the court and he immediately says, "Look, everybody, look at this that I bear. I'm a wretched sinner, and you should all look on me because I failed you. I'm a failed knight. I failed you." And so what do they say in response to this? The king gave comfort, the whole of the court, as they laugh in lovely accord. that the lords and ladies who belong to the table should bear such a belt crosswise like a sash for the sake of this man. And each knight who held it was honored ever after. All the best books of romance remind us. Well, there's really actually only one book of romance that reminds us, and that's this, the best book of romance. So I like the author's little plug for himself there. But if you go to the Middle English, the line is, and he honored, or for that was accorded the renown of the Round Table. Renown. That was accorded the renown of the Round Table. Now, how do we go from it being this mark of sin and shame to being the renown of the Round Table? Another way to think about that word, renown, literally rename, remake. Sir Gawain is a new creation through his repentance, through his confession and his repentance. And sure, he bears the mark of sin on the slash, the scar on his neck, and the visible sign of that, the sash. Tolkien translates it as the glory of the Round Table. Whose glory? Whose renown? Tolkien best describes the process of the poem when he says, after the shame, the repentance, and then the unreserved confession with sorrow and penance, and at last not only forgiveness, but the redemption, so that the harm that is not concealed and the reproach that is voluntarily borne become a glory evermore after. So even we as Catholics are in danger of missing this message, of reading the poem as if Christ's forgiveness isn't a sufficient cause for laughter and rejoicing, as if the cross of Christ can't paradoxically be both at once a reminder of Christ's brutal punishment for our sin and a glorious sign of our redemption. Think only of that beautiful poem, The Dream of the Rood, where the dreamer sees at once the cross dripping with blood and then bedecked with jewels. So I'll close with this quotation from Bishop Eric Varden and what he says about the wounds of sin, because I think it provides a helpful way to understand the meaning of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. He says, sin leaves its mark on our spirit and on our body. To be fully human is to own this state of affairs. It is to be reconciled to loss and the inevitability of death. But it is no less to remember that our woundedness is of time and that time will pass. The Christian gospel envisions the passage from a frank acknowledgement of wounds to the prospect of definitive healing. It proposes a vista of transformation, a new heaven and a new earth where death will be no more, mourning and crying and pain will be no more. There, the first things have passed. The first things, though, must happen first. This paradoxical dynamic is at the heart of what St. Paul calls the logic of the cross. It is madness to the world, but to those who madly determine to construct their existence on its terms, a source of power, healing, and joy. Thank you.